note about the fact that Marty is in the throes of finishing the 4th edition of his book on virology, and it got stopped near the finishing when this occurred, Marty, right?
Well, we haven't stopped. We're trying to figure out how to add to it. The publisher has the final draft, and they're delayed now because it's a British publisher, Wiley, and they're all sort of locked down also. So with that delay, it gives us time to think about how we want to incorporate something about this pandemic into what will be the final version.
And I know as part of that process, you've interviewed a lot of researchers about the work that they're doing. And
yes.
You indicated you had a PowerPoint that you could show us today if we wanted to see that. Do you want to start that? Go ahead, Marty.
Sure, I'll start that. Just briefly to give us sort of some talking points or place to stimulate questions. And these are just some slides that I've been using. I have used this semester with my class at UNM Taos, which happens to be this semester, fortunately, medical microbiology. So just to start a little bit, giving you a little bit of background on the virus itself, and some of a quick primer on what's being done in terms of trying to deal with this infection. As I'm sure you all know, this is now a pandemic. Pandemic literally means the infection is global. 3.3 million cases this morning worldwide, with nearing 250,000 deaths. In the US, a little over 1 million, 1.1 million with 64,000 deaths. And in New Mexico, 3,400 roughly cases with 123 deaths. We've been blessed in New Mexico thus far. 18 cases in Taos County with no recorded deaths from it. So this is a significant event in history of the world, quite literally. And in my history as a virologist, it's the third pandemic that as a professional I've been involved in. This one, the most significant, well, it's hard to say. HIV/AIDS, a much larger death toll, but not as significant in terms of the immediate impact that this one is having. Let me just start really with a little introduction to human coronaviruses. The name corona comes from the fact that when you do an electron microscopic image of the virus, you see this array of spikes all the way around it like this, which looks like the corona of the sun during an eclipse, and thus the name coronavirus given to very early. There are a number of the variety animal species around the world. There are 10 that are coronaviruses. 4 of them.
Marty, you're garbled.
Something like, how's that? Is that better?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Something like the common cold, and are of really no consequence. They're a minor component of what we call the common cold. But the 3 in more interest are original one that was called SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, that came out of China, originated in China in 2005. So it's now called SARS-CoV-1. The second one was the Middle East respiratory syndrome virus, obviously in the Middle East. This is a virus that's transmitted only from camels to humans. So it's a virus that causes disease in people who work with camels. The original SARS caused disease around the world, but not that many cases, and then kind of disappeared. And then we have the one we're dealing with now, SARS-CoV-2, the cause of COVID-19. We're pretty much convinced that this virus had its origin in bats. Bats have a lot of coronaviruses worldwide, and this one we think originated in a bat somewhere in China, maybe near Wuhan, we're not sure. And much like the other 2 that are dangerous, the original SARS from 2005 was a bat virus, as is the camel virus. So passing from a bat through some intermediate host and then on to humans. We're not sure exactly of this pathway for SARS-CoV-2, maybe the pangolin, maybe the other animals. Some people have implicated these wet markets in Wuhan. Maybe that's the case. We're not absolutely certain yet. It is clear that the virus has natural origins. It's not a laboratory creation of any kind, and that's been pretty much validated by everybody that's looked at protein sequence comparisons of the virus. It affects cells in our body that have on their surface a receptor protein called ACE2, angiotensin converting enzyme 2. And this protein is present on the surface of cells in a lot of different places, but most prominently in our upper respiratory system, cells in your nose, as well as cells in the lung. The virus attaches to that protein, makes its way into the cell where it is uncoated. So the inner workings of the virus, the RNA that's the genome of the virus comes out, is able to replicate, is able to make new proteins and new virus particles, and they come back out of the cell and infect neighboring cells. So this is a very common pathway for a lot of different viruses, especially respiratory viruses. Influenza has the same kind of pathway of entry. The typical symptoms of COVID-19, the disease as it's called, originally defined by CDC and World Health Organization, were mainly fever and dry cough. About 80% of the cases, as I'm sure you heard, are mild to moderate cases. The rest can result in hospitalization and IC intensive care unit stays for people, and those are the ones that become quite deadly. We can talk later if you have questions about how we look at the fatality rate of this virus. That's somewhat controversial these days and very difficult to kind of measure. We can address that in questions. More recently, there have been new symptoms added. This now is the set of symptoms that World Health Organization and CDC want us to consider: chills, repeated shaking with chills, muscle pain, headache, sore throat, and loss of taste and smell are now added to the fever and dry cough symptoms. The real problem with the virus results when it gets into the lungs and produces a serious inflammation in the lungs that doctors called ground glass opacities, this kind of graying area here in this CAT scan. And when this builds up, like it is here in this drawing, that's what leads to the inability of the patients to be able to breathe and the necessity of putting them on ventilators when the lungs completely clog up with this congestion. We test for the virus two ways. The way that's been done most effectively worldwide is testing for the presence of the genetic information of the virus, the RNA, in nasal swabs. That's called an RT-PCR, reverse transcriptase polymerase chain reaction test, and that's the one on the top here. That's what we've been trying to do to actually define COVID-19 cases. The test has a pretty good, I'm going to say, efficiency, except that the virus isn't always present in the nasal secretions. So very often, people who have COVID-19 symptoms don't test positive because at the time the swab is taken, the viral particles are not present in the nose. Our daughter-in-law fell into that category in Virginia. She had all the symptoms but did not test positive. Thank God she's recovered now and is well on the way to coming out of that. The more recent attempt has been to test for people who have been exposed to the virus, and that's by the detection of antibodies to the virus, and that's this bottom example. And in this case, what we're asking is, has somebody been exposed so that their immune system has produced antibodies that react to the antigens, the proteins of the virus particles? We're looking for two kinds of antibodies, IgM and IgG, both of which rise up in our circulation after we've been exposed to something like this. And the hope is that ultimately those antibodies would be protected, and that would be the point of a vaccine strategy. And vaccine strategies are in the works, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I've already sort of mentioned COVID-19 in the US and Mexico. You can find, of course, current numbers on the internet for that. One line of attack that you've been hearing about in the news is an antiviral therapy. The most promising one is this one, remdesivir, that I'm circling right here, is the one that seems to block very effectively in cell culture the replication of the virus in the cell, blocking the enzyme that causes it to make more genomes. But there are other ones that are being looked at some drugs that block attachment, some drugs that block the digestion of the viral proteins into functional fragments. This one, of course, is the malaria drug that's now not being promoted because of the negative side effects it has. So all of these are being looked at. There's some 560 antiviral therapy trials underway worldwide right now. And we hear mainly about the ones like remdesivir, but there are tons of them going on. That's kind of the next goal, is to find something that would actually block the replication of the virus in patients. And the remdesivir results are encouraging. The final treatment, though, the final conquering of this is, well, this is just talking about the more than 500 clinical trials. The final treatment would be the vaccine approach. There are currently at least 6 vaccine tests going on worldwide using a variety of different strategies. Vaccines basically present some version of the virus protein to the cell, to the immune system, so that our immune system then develops an antibody response that is protective, so-called neutralizing antibodies. And it takes a while. You have to go through several phases. Typically, the way we always have done this, it takes several years. Everybody's trying to accelerate this now through a series of trials that, while focused on safety, are also focused on speed. We just heard in the news recently about the Oxford vaccine trial. Oxford University has a version of a vaccine that is very promising. They're way ahead of the other groups that are doing this because they had a vaccine in progress for MERS, the camel virus, that had already been approved in Britain through the first phase of trials as safe. So all they had to do was replace the information for the protein from the camel-related virus with the one from SARS-CoV-2, and now they've got something that they think will work. It is now being put into some 6,000 test subjects in the UK. A version of, or the vaccine itself was sent to our Rocky Mountain labs in Montana, where it was used with, I think, 6 macaque rhesus monkeys who are also susceptible to this virus. And after they were treated, after they developed the antibodies, they were then challenged with SARS-CoV-2, and after 28 days, they are still healthy. So that's a really good sign that the primates that are related to us have developed an immune response to this virus. The Oxford group has now linked up with AstraZeneca, which is a Cambridge-based sort of British-Swiss drug company, and are talking about being able to, by the end of the year, if this vaccine is indeed successful, produce literally millions and millions of doses of it as their first effort to hide infect. That's just a bit of background to stimulate question.
You're garbled again.
Go through, how's that? Go through? I think it's, my mouse gets frozen and it causes the garbling. I may come off my earphones and go to let me go to the, I'll go to the built-in speakers and
Nothing. Can't hear you.
You muted yourself.
There you go.
There I am. Okay.
Oh, good.
All right. So I get rid of my earphones so that they're garbling. Okay. Let's just start with questions in general about any of that or anything else that you've heard that I could maybe help clarify.
I was recently read a list of symptoms for people who are older, being different from the standard ones that you had presented, and I wondered if you knew anything about that and had something to say.
Of course, the more at-risk people are the older population, those of us who are over 65, 60 or 65, and also people with any underlying conditions called comorbidities. So people with diabetes, high blood pressure, any kind of respiratory conditions can be comorbidities. But the general issue for older patients has to do with the virus after it gets in the lungs and starts to generate an immune response, causing a hyperimmune response, which then becomes an inflammatory condition that doesn't have to, but can lead to what's called a cytokine storm, a sudden rush of overreacting immune cells and proteins that can ultimately wind up producing multiple organ failure. So more widespread effects on the body than just the lungs. And that's one of the things that people worry about, especially with the older population.
Hi, I
Hi,
just have a
Erin.
question in regards to, came out with like a study or something saying that people with IBS or IBD were susceptible to getting the virus more. Is that true? Is there any validity to that?
In any of the conditions that are immune related, and IBS is certainly one of those, like Crohn's disease,
Yeah.
or for instance lupus, or rheumatoid arthritis, where the immune system is already compromised, has an issue with more serious potential complications from the infection. If that's what you're referring to, yeah.
Yeah, that was my question. Thank you.
Marty, I've heard that they're increasingly seeing signs of kidney failure of COVID patients needing both a respirator and a dialysis machine.
Yeah.
Has that been, do we know anything more about that, or how common is that?
One of the problems with this virus is because it's only been around for a few months, data is constantly being updated as people see more and more patients, as we get more and more experience. And yes, there's more and more evidence that this is not simply limited always just to the lungs. In fact, a piece came out just 2 days ago saying that receptor I talked about, ACE2, is present on a whole variety of tissues in the body. So potentially, the virus could infect us almost anywhere, including the heart. The lining of the pericardium of the heart has ACE2 receptors on it. So it's not beyond a possibility that we're seeing other organs being affected. Now, it isn't generally so that the kidneys are being infected on everyone who's got the virus, but certainly that's one other organ that's been seen, is kidney failure in some of these patients that wind up in ICUs. Again, this is a brand new virus, the novel coronavirus, in the sense that we're learning things about it. You're seeing science work in real time here, in the sense that people are gathering data, sharing it around the world, and then checking it in studies and corroborating it. Even treatment modalities are changing as we speak. For instance, all of a sudden now they've decided patients should be put on their stomach, pronate, because it helps them breathe better. And that wasn't true originally. So, I mean, things like that are happening even as we watch it in real time.
Marty, beyond the presence of comorbidity or other vulnerable things that are occurring, are we getting any information about why some people get so seriously impacted and others do not? And, does it have, at first they were talking it was age related, and we have less cases in young children. Does any of that start to inform us about why you might be really serious and why not?
There's a study, there are several studies, I'm going to say at least a dozen, they're looking at the genetics of people who get the disease. trying to use some of our information from the Human Genome Project to ferret out what kinds of genetic patterns might be associated with more severe forms of the disease. And that's just in its infancy. I saw the first paper about that last week, and it's not even a fully fleshed out paper. It was just stating, here's what we're looking at, here are the kinds of approaches we're using, and we'll have more to say about it as data can be gathered from patient studies. I mean, that's basically, they're asking for patients, for doctors who are treating patients, to provide them with some genetic information that could be correlated in some way with the severity. So that's right now the only, that's a real approach, and maybe the only one that we will get some information from, other than the comorbidity stuff, which is a little more obvious.
Yeah.
You may have seen in the news that there are people who are saying they have evidence that there are many more people who've been exposed to the virus than we know from the COVID positive numbers that we're looking at, which feeds into a story about this being less fatal than we originally thought. And that case fatality number, it often is simply done by just taking the number of deaths, dividing that by the number of cases, and getting what's called a case fatality number. It's not that simple, though, as it turns out, because there are a lot of complications this early in a pandemic that we don't know. So, for instance, we've been testing patients with symptoms. What about asymptomatic patients, right? So that was the aim of that Stanford study that you may have read about, was to go out in the community and look for antibodies to say anybody who's got antibodies would have been exposed to the virus. Great idea. I saw the paper when it first came out about a week ago, week and a half now. And I'm not a biostatistician, but I could see immediately that the paper was totally flawed in its approach. For instance, they recruited volunteers through Facebook. So that's not a randomized population sample. If you ask on Facebook, would you like to come and be tested at this site, you're going to get people who think they have symptoms already, who can't get a test, who will come to your site and get the antibody test. So you're sort of biasing the population to people who might be positive anyway. That was one. Second was the antibody test they used was not even one of the ones that the FDA had approved, which already are flawed. This was one from China, that China has stopped them from exporting it so bad. So that was number two. And number three, they extrapolated from 50 positives in Santa Clara County out of a total of 3,000 they tested to generalize to the entire country. So if their numbers were off by any of the problems with either bias or flawed testing, then their results are totally skewed. So people all over who have seen the preprint, like I did, have jumped on this, but nonetheless, it's made it into the press to try to say, well, this isn't really any more deadly than flu. And I think we're going to find out that that's not true. It's probably at least 10 times deadlier than flu, at least 10. The seasonal flu I'm talking about. The other problem with it is we don't know how many deaths actually to ascribe to COVID-19. Because a lot of people have died outside of the hospital setting, at home, and people really don't know. There's clearly in the data a greater than expected seasonal death rate in cities where this is taking place. And to ascribe the ones that are not diagnosed directly in a hospital to COVID-19 is very difficult. Did they die from the virus? Did they die from some other condition they had where they just couldn't get to the hospital, but they never were infected? What's going on with all that? So we're not going to get a clear number for the case fatality rate for a long time. But 64,000 people is a lot of people dying. So, I mean, we just have to face the fact that this is a real thing. And in any situations, especially when you see the foci of infection and deaths in some conditions like the meatpacking plants in the Midwest, like prisons, like nursing homes. Those are places where this is spreading like wildfire and deaths are following.
Okay.
Erin, sorry.
Um, I just have another question. Sorry. As social workers and counselors, some of us are, while using all the protocols and everything of wearing a mask, we're still seeing clients in person. I am, and some of the other people that work with kids are, to help them with their homework and all that stuff. So while we are using all the standard protocols of wearing a mask, disinfecting everything, staying 6 feet apart as much as we can, and limiting the number of people in a group, as essential workers, I feel like we're kind of being left out of that like testing population. Should those of us that are still seeing clients in person be tested?
My opinion, everybody should be tested who wants a test for any reason, never mind the symptomology. I would hope that eventually we could get there. To be honest, I know that Holy Cross, for instance, has a limited number of tests available. So I was very pleased that they were able to go back a second time and test everybody at the Living Center. Yeah. That was great. Once they found out that some of the staff were infected, they went back in, because that's totally needs our attention. But I agree with you. Everybody who's out in any kind of essential job right now, which is you guys, which for that matter are the people working at Albertsons and Smiths. You know, I would hope everybody could be tested, because they're all at risk. The delivery people who come to our house from UPS are putting themselves at risk, just as you guys are, to do what you do. And anybody who's in that position should have availability for testing, so that they can know where they stand, either the antibody test or if necessary, the virus test itself. But we're limited. We just, I mean, you all know, I'm sure, that the limit is not just on the test kit, but it's on the swabs, it's on the reagents, it's on the processing time, all those things.
Marty, do you have any idea how limited the tests really are at Holy Cross, and whether, you know, Taos Behavioral Health could get them to come on site and test everyone?
That's a good question. I know that it says on the dashboard for the state that we've performed 1,000 or so tests in Taos County to get the number 18 positive. That's in the little dialog box on the website. I'm not sure who to connect, but I would try to connect at least with the hospital administration and see if you could be included as providers in any testing protocol they've got, like they did at the Living Center. Especially, as you said, Erin, when you're there, you've got to be you're doing all the protocols right, but you've got to be face-to-face with clients during this time, when you can't do everything by Zoom.
No.
So I would suggest, Mary, getting in touch with the hospital administration to see if somehow you could be rolled into that.
That would be amazing.
Wouldn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it really would. Just peace of mind and making sure that, you know, we're not asymptomatic, and those kids that are coming, like, I just want to protect them.
Exactly. You know, it's for you to know that you're not of danger to your clients.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Do we have any understanding of why children seem to be less
susceptible?
Yeah.
The very young seem to not even get anything. I don't think anybody has an answer for that yet. Again, so new. Everybody's working through data like mad, and I've not seen anybody have any really good suggestion why the very young are apparently more resistant to this than apparently the break is around preteen years. After that, then everybody seems to be in the same ballpark in terms of getting infected, not in terms of the severity of the infection.
Yes.
Yeah.
Given all of the variables, what's available, what's not available, and the changes that are going on around us, meaning Texas is opening, Colorado is starting to open, and remembering that back in March, when they first started reporting numbers, Taos County was actually considered the worst county in the state, you know, in terms of population. Okay.
Right, per capita.
And yeah, and that's because we wind up with so many people who want to come to the mountains. Either they think there's nobody in New Mexico and they're going to be safe, or they're Texans who want to get cool.
Right.
Okay, so given those set of variables, and I think it's a situation that once things start relaxing, people themselves will relax in their attitude. So fine, you wear your mask when you go to the grocery store, and you wear it for the first week. Let's say that the governor opens us up after mid-May. You wear it, okay, not in the clinical situation, but ordinary people, when you're not in that situation, and people are going to, it seems to me that people are going to relax, okay, and stop wearing gloves when they go to get gas, because you're not close to anybody. So then you forget the mask. What should people continue to implement as for their own safety as everything relaxes?
So I think our governor has been really adamant about saying that we're going to follow the science and look at the rate, the number of new cases, the sort of the numbers that we need to see that it's decreasing, in fact. But the issue is going to be that even if we do that, even if we have 2 weeks of decreasing cases, and she says, fine, let's open back up, you still have the issue that it's probably not gone. And that's, if not this summer, certainly by fall, we're likely to see it again. So my advice always to people who are more at risk is to continue doing the social distancing until there's a way that we can be assured we ourselves are protected. If you're interested in your own protection, right? So I think Gail and I personally don't plan to be out of social distancing until there's a vaccine available. And I said this to our family last weekend. We've got 3 people in the family with immune conditions. And they were rather shocked to hear me say that. They said, you mean we have to be like this for another year? I said, well, yeah, if you really want to assure yourself that you're not going to be in jeopardy. That being said, I think we're going to just have to play it by ear as we see things open up. Now, about our cases, remember the first few cases in Taos County were all travel related and or ski valley related. The first 6 to 8 cases were people who had traveled and come home, or people who had been in Ski Valley working that last weekend when there was that case from the East Coast who was at Snake Dance. And so there were a few cases in Ski Valley, and then the travelers. Absent that, we sort of settled into a 1 case a week kind of thing. So I don't know that we're the worst any longer, but certainly 18 for a 30,000 population county is not, keeps us up in there in the running, if you want to call it that, for severe.
Marty, one of the things that really concerned me was the article in this week's Taos News about the couple that is sequestered. They were in Denver and then they were in Paris, but they have been tested, they're asymptomatic, they have been tested 4 times and still show positive presence of the virus.
That's right.
That's really alarming.
That's stunning. Yeah, that was stunning to read. And they're doing everything right. They're just the 2 of them, and where they live in Ojosarco, and they're keeping quarantine, and they've been in quarantine for 50 days.
Right.
And can't be, and are still virus positive. That's kind of strange. I don't know what that means. So they're thinking that they need another kind of test, it said, some way of assuring that they're actually looking at virus and not just remnants of virus. That's one of the problems. The test for it looks at the presence of viral RNA. That doesn't mean that virus particles are still there, that are live, in other words, that are infectious. So in order to do that, you have to do an actual culture. So I think that's what they said they were going to try to have done, to find out if they're actually really making virus, or do they just have remnants of it still after all this time.
So you have to have a test that will differentiate that, whether it's
you have to,
remnants that are not live.
You have to have somebody sample the virus and try to grow it in culture. It's much more elaborate. It's not a simple thing to do.
Yeah, that was kind of
It was
frightening.
strange. Yeah, kind of strange. I feel bad for them. They're both healthy. They're no symptoms, but they're stuck at home and have been for 50 days.
Yeah.
Even quarantined from each other.
Yes.
Which was very severe. Yeah.
Has anything been said about the drugs that the people with immune diseases need? Are they becoming more available now that it's been shown that it's not effective for this virus, so it's not being hoarded or purchased or anything like that?
So that's a really good question. I don't know. I haven't seen that anybody make a statement. Now, we know anecdotal-ish things about people we know who need those drugs who haven't been able to get them. Our nieces, for instance, who are both lupus patients in California, have had trouble getting chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine that they need. We have a friend here in Taos, same situation. She has rheumatoid arthritis. I don't know if they're becoming more available. I know that there are still clinical trials using those drugs. The one we think about is the VA numbers, where it was a controlled trial. They had patients with and without it, and they showed that the patients on it actually fared worse than the patients that weren't on it in terms of recovery. So that put a really big damper on the whole hype about it. But there are still other trials going on, so people can get a bit more data about it. But I don't know if that's lessened the demand for it. I mean, the government bought up a whole lot of the drug based on the hype, and it's sitting in a stockpile now. So I don't know whether they've released it back to be prescribed again. I mean, the hopeful sign in terms of antivirals are not just remdesivir. And that study kind of looked funky to people because it was just a 30% effect. So I know people are saying, well, it's moderate. What's the big deal? But that's how you start in these drug trials. That was given to patients who were in ICU. And it did improve the outcome of people who were on it, which is the hopeful sign. But the issue is, as Tony Fauci said, that leads to the next step. Take that drug and combine it with something else, or take that drug and administer it to people early on in the infection and now see what happens. So that's what these clinical trials do. They get some hopeful sign like that, and then they say, okay, let's push it now. Let's modify the approach, or let's combine it with another drug and see if the two of them together now get us to the place where, for instance, we have with Tamiflu with influenza. So you know that if you get early symptoms of flu and you take Tamiflu, you can block the virus, but you have to do it early on. So hopefully we could get somewhere like that with these drugs, so that if somebody came down with early symptoms of COVID-19 and got prescribed something, they could block the progression. But we're not quite there yet with these studies.
I have seen some recommendations, but probably this is just basic health recommendations, that you should be doing really well with nutrition and really well with physical exercise in order to help the body maintain its immune system well.
Right.
Any comments about that?
You don't want to see your immune system depressed in any way. And yes, malnutrition, poor nutrition will do that, because your immune system depends on cells' ability to replicate fast, to divide fast, and that all depends on nutrition. So clearly nutrition is a plus. Exercise the same way has a positive effect on stimulating cell division for cells that are dividing. Okay, there's a lot of information about that. So anything like that to keep yourself in good health is great to lessen the effect if you did get infected. It's not a guarantee, though. It's just something that you would do just in the normal course of anything to keep healthy. And I think that Gail's organization, the Center for Integrative Medicine at Arizona, has a nice list of things that are suggested to do to keep yourself healthy that include nutrition, exercise, some additives to diet that have been shown to stimulate the immune system, like adding zinc to the diet, a few others like that. And I don't know, Gail, would you send the link to everybody for that page that you've got, or maybe that PDF that?
I'll just send to the COVID-19 resources that the center put out, which include a variety of things. They have a webinar, they have like a short white paper on various things that can be done. So I'll send the link to the resource page.
Great.
That'd be good, yeah.
Great.
And Erin, you might enjoy that just in terms of what you can do personally, and the rest of you. I don't know who else is who's on with us right now, is seeing patients regularly like you are, but to have something that you feel you can do to help strengthen yourself in terms of your own immune system.
Well, as mental health professionals, I think everyone knows that being depressed or highly stressed also affects the immune system. So our ability to maintain positive thoughts or maintain positive relationships or keep in touch with those who nurture you is also really important because of the impact that has.
It's true. And I think the center's advice for some of that is included in what you're going to see. Things like doing some kind of meditative practice, some other kinds of stress relief. Certainly exercise is a good thing to do to relieve stress. So all of those things are critically important just to stay healthy in any time, but especially in a time like this. Here we are in a pandemic, guys. It's unique in most of our lives.
If any of us are millionaires and have a lot of money, where would you put money?
Well, somebody who is a millionaire and no, billions and billions of heirs is Bill Gates.
Right.
And look where he's putting his money. I mean, he's really putting money behind the vaccine development.
Yeah.
There's another group, they're calling it the Manhattan Project of COVID-19, a group of billionaires and scientists who have developed a kind of private approach to ultimately vaccine development. I know some of the scientists that signed on to that letter. So people who are kind of aware of how these things work know that our way out of this is really to get enough people in the population protected by their immune system against the virus so that it can no longer spread. The spread of the virus is measured by something called the R0, or the replication number. When that's above 1, it means it's spreading. So this virus right now has an R0 of around 2 to 3, which means that every person who's infected will infect 2 or 3 other people. That's why it's contagious. It's not the most contagious virus we know of. That's like measles. This one is pretty contagious though. If you can get the R0 below that, below 1, then it stops the spread. And that's called the herd effect. And the way to get the herd effect without getting everybody sick like Sweden's trying to do is to actually vaccinate people. So a vaccine is the total target for getting through this. And the numbers from the Oxford study give us hope that this will actually generate protective antibodies in people, and a vaccine would be the way to go. So the question is, how do we get to a vaccine safely? How do we do that, but without trashing the whole economy completely? That's the conundrum that everybody's in right now. Clearly, if we all stayed in our houses until next year, we'd be fine. Yeah. But we can't do that and survive as an economy, right?
Just from your knowledge of viruses, knowing that this is the new one, if we get the trend going down and people start to feel safe, and then we have a resurgence, is there any evidence that resurgence may be even more serious because the virus may have learned some new things about how to be effective and maintain?
Okay, so let's just talk about the learn some new things piece, which is about the virus mutating.
Yeah.
Okay, and everybody sees reports, oh, the virus mutates. Well, all viruses mutate. And RNA viruses like this one mutate faster than others. But within the range of RNA viruses, some mutate much, much faster, like HIV is the one that mutates the fastest of any we know. Generates mutations so fast that we can't make a vaccine to it. That's been a struggle. Next, about 10 times less fast than that is influenza. And it mutates such that each year we need a new vaccine because it manages to escape the ones we had last year. Coronavirus seems to be another level up again in terms of slowness. So its mutation rate is much less than influenza, and the mutations that have been going around so far seem not to be in the direction of making it more dangerous. People have been charting them, okay? So we're not, nobody's thinking that it's actually mutating to be more pathogenic. The problem with the resurgence, the second wave, if you will, is comparing it, first of all, people compare it to the 1918 flu, okay, which in its second wave was much deadlier for reasons that have to do both with the virus changing as well as population behavior changing. People got tired of quarantining, and the second wave really hit when people were back out in the street. This one, the second wave, you have to listen to what Fauci and the others are saying, may be complicated by seasonal flu coming along at the same time. So that you've got two infections that could be compromising people. And that could make it more difficult to manage in terms of how many people get infected and how many people suffer serious consequences. So whether there's a second wave or not, people like Tony Fauci and others are convinced there will be. I got to go along with him, but we don't have any data. To be honest, SARS-1 disappeared. It went pandemic, more or less. It didn't have a lot of cases. Everybody was waiting for the second shoe to drop the next year. People mounted vaccine preparation campaigns, and it disappeared. It went away, and nobody knows why. And for this one, who knows? We won't know until we're this time next year what happened. But
so even if there's no vaccine for COVID-19, should we still get a flu shot?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. In fact, there was an interesting article in the Times today where some researchers are arguing that there's a long story about vaccination with other kinds of vaccines that are live organism vaccines, like the one that was developed in France at the beginning of the 20th century called BCG for tuberculosis. It's a tuberculosis vaccine, and it's a non-pathogenic version of that bacterium. And often when you give that vaccine to a person, it boosts their entire immune system, especially what's called their innate immune system. And so the idea is that could be a transition to waiting for a vaccine to give everybody a shot of BCG. Or another one is the oral poliovirus, which we don't use so much anymore. That one has a similar kind of effect. If you look at data, children who were inoculated with that rarely got flu afterwards, because it's not initiating a response to flu, but boosting their innate response. So that might be a transitional way of doing it, this article suggests. So they're actually looking at some clinical studies now about that. So a lot of different possibilities here to get us through this next year. But the bottom line is we're not going to have herd immunity till we have 70% or more of the population making neutralizing antibodies to this virus. And that's when it'll disappear, or at least be under control, because it'll stop spreading.